Today is Monday, March 19th. I am, of course, Jack Berlin, and this is Politically Charged. Welcome back to the third, maybe fourth episode. I think it's the third. Fourth episode of the new and improved Politically Charged. I'm, of course, Jack Berlin, and real quick before we start, I got some housekeeping to take care of. There's a special edition episode coming out Wednesday or Thursday morning on a topic that really and truly does not get the attention it deserves in the media with all of the absurdity, for lack of a better term, that is involved in the Trump administration thus far. Also, we are now on SoundCloud, finally, after several months of forgetting to actually do that. So, if SoundCloud is where you listen to podcasts for some reason, go ahead and search up Politically Charged. It will pop up. And with that, let's get into the thick of this episode where we start in Pennsylvania. A story coming out of there that could end up being pretty drastic foreshadowing of the 2018 midterms. Democrats picked up a seat we had absolutely no business having. On Tuesday, Conor Lamb, a moderate Democrat, former Marine, and former prosecutor, won the special election for Pennsylvania's 18th district by less than 1,000 votes against a Republican who happily described himself as Trump before Trump was Trump. The Pennsylvania 18th was a district that President Trump won in the 2016 election by 20 points, and 4 years before him, Mitt Romney won by 17. Now you might be asking yourself, why in the world is this a lead-off topic for a podcast episode? Why is this somewhat random special election for a district that won't even exist this time next year so important? And it's simple, because of the drastic change in the way the district voted. The president is such a polarizing figure that Democratic activism and participation in the political process has risen to a level that's made 20-point swings in a traditionally Republican district possible. The vast majority of seats in Congress that are up for election in the 2018 midterms are in districts that the president won by less than 20 points, meaning that there's a great chance that Democrats can retake the House of Representatives at the very least. The Senate is a whole different animal, a whole different process. Even if 20-point swings like the one we saw last week in the Pennsylvania 18th are outliers in the upcoming midterms, the 2018 midterms, which statistically speaking in all likelihood they are, a swing of 8 or even 10 points, 6 points, could have a devastating impact on Republicans' ability to hold vulnerable seats. So far, Republicans' response to this loss has been to paint the Democratic candidate in the Pennsylvania 18th, Conor Lamb, as some kind of moderate Democrat with conservative tendencies. Really, this couldn't be further from the truth, and I'm not entirely sure who decided this was the best path for Republicans to take. Conor Lamb campaigned for expanded background checks, against the Trump tax cut for the wealthy, for universal health care, for a woman's right to choose, and for medical marijuana. All of which are ideas that Republicans have not only come out against, but have pretty much actually doubled down on being against. So while it's now Republicans' turn to struggle to justify losing an election they never should have lost while trying to reassure vulnerable congressmen and women that they won't suffer the same fate, Democrats get to enjoy the boost of such an improbable win. However, the problem with this is that Conor Lamb's victory has once again fanned the flames of the barely simmering civil war in the Democratic Party. On one side, you have the progressive faction, led by the likes of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, that's really grown exponentially in terms of popularity in the last few years. On the other hand, you have moderate Democrats like Conor Lamb, who support the majority of kind of typical Democratic ideas, such as universal health care and a woman's right to choose, but they kind of stray from the pack on various issues like supporting Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House. The clash between these two competing factions is only further exemplified by a moderate Democrat flipping a district that Trump had won by 20 points. The Democratic Civil War pretty much comes down to two trains of thought. One, should the Democratic Party be rigid in its platform, meaning should candidates be pushed towards running on progressive ideals because that's what's popular right now, that's what gets the retweets on Twitter, mentions on Facebook, other social media things, or should candidates be allowed the freedom to tailor their message to fit their district like Conor Lamb did, obviously successfully? Now, there's no question there's definitely strong points to be made for both sides. But honestly, I think the answer to this question, the answer to this civil war, for lack of a better term, is pretty simple. The Democratic Party needs to maintain the reputation as the big tent party, especially in this era of hyperpartisanship and Republicans vacating leadership. And we need to adopt an inclusive strategy, not only because it'll help win seats, as we've seen, but because it's the right thing to do. Allow candidates to tailor their message to their districts. Maybe, like Connor Lamb, they feel a $15 minimum wage sounds too high. That's not to say that they're completely against raising the minimum wage, just that they have some trepidation about raising it to that number. In my view, Democrats need to support a platform that allows for some variance between each candidate. I would love to see the National Democratic Party focus more on broad points, support broad points like universal health care, a woman's right to choose, increasing the minimum wage, come out strongly against cuts to Social Security and tax cuts for the rich, and finally for common sense gun control. Now, I may personally support a ban on assault rifles and a large increase to the minimum wage, as I'm pretty sure I've mentioned in past episodes, but that doesn't mean you're not a Democrat if you disagree with that, or you disagree with how far I'm willing to go. The analogy I always use is the pulling of levers and from every theory in moderation. An airplane pilot or a train conductor doesn't push the lever responsible for the flaps or the train speed all the way in one direction. They push a little on each lever so they balance out and keep the ride smooth. There's almost never a magic lever that is a one-size-fits-all for something in anything, especially politics. And the same idea applies to the Democratic Party as a whole. We need to be more inclusive, not only so that we can pick up seats the way that Connor Lamb did, in which he flipped a district that Trump won by 20 points, but more importantly, so more people feel involved in the Democratic Party. That was one of the huge issues in the 2016 presidential election. If the national platform became exclusively progressive or exclusively moderate, it would turn off a huge portion of the Democratic base, possibly suppressing turnout at the polls or even giving Republicans extra votes. We need to remain the big tent party, where variances of Democratic ideas are tolerated and discussed, debated. Otherwise, we're giving Republicans an opening simply out of carelessness. Speaking of carelessness, actually that's a pretty good segue. Last week, Senate Republicans passed legislation that rolled back some of the regulations put in place on the banking industry following the 2008 Great Recession. In particular, this legislation lowers the threshold for what defines a bank as a systematically important institution, a qualification that forces banks to be subject to more intense oversight, the idea behind which is rooted in preventing a collapse like we saw in 2008. Right now, the threshold stands at $50 billion, but the legislation calls for it to be raised to $250 billion. Those in favor, which include 16 Democratic senators for some reason, have argued that banks that are relieved from the more stringent requirements will still face stress tests from time to time, and the Federal Reserve maintains the right to adopt enhanced supervision on a case-by-case basis. However, it's been noted by those against the bill that only a few of these deregulated banks would have to fail in order for a similar situation to the events preceding the 2008 financial collapse to occur. One of the institutions at the center of that 2008 financial collapse, Countrywide Financial, would receive less stringent standards under this legislation. Simply put, the threshold should be raised, but raising it by $200 billion is short-sighted less than a decade after the Great Recession. This is a tough subject to kind of talk about on the podcast, especially for me, as in absolutely no way, shape, or form am I even close to an expert on regulation of the financial system. And it's not exactly the greatest thing to talk about to get ratings and views. But it seems like common sense to lean toward the side of caution when it comes to our financial system. We absolutely should not be raising thresholds meant to act as safeguards just to gain some favor from banks and corporations. I'm extremely disappointed that there were 16 Democratic senators that signed on to this bill. But again, it only highlights the importance of winning back Congress so that we can introduce more moderate reforms that provide relief to some of the smaller banks that the legislation claims to be aimed at, but are weighted more heavily towards protecting the financial system from another collapse. Moving on to things more easily talked about on this podcast, the unprecedented turnover of the Trump administration continues, this time claiming Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in what is being called Regxit. Rather than using his signature catchphrase, President Trump fired Secretary Tillerson over Twitter, capping off almost a year of will he or won't he drama. After describing Tillerson at the time as, quote, one of the truly great business leaders of the world, following his nomination to the position of Secretary of State, the president almost immediately started to clash with his secretary. Highlights of the duo's time together include President Trump calling out his secretary on Twitter for suggesting negotiations with North Korea, my personal favorite, claiming he would beat his secretary in an IQ test, and Secretary Tillerson reportedly calling the president a blanking moron, which is one of the more unique ways I've ever seen someone try to curry favor with their boss. But on top of all this, before you feel bad for the secretary, it has to be noted that he did some serious and lasting damage to the institution of the State Department. By all accounts, the morale of the department as a whole has really never been lower. Experts who have made careers out of studying one country have been put on the sidelines and not listened to, and he failed to ever get around to filling key positions. Not exactly living up to the president's claim of only hiring the best people. Secretary Tillerson's replacement is Mike Pompeo, current director of the CIA and former House of Representative Tea Party member. And we love the Tea Party here on this podcast. Thus far into the Trump administration, Pompeo has shown himself to be a Trump loyalist, injecting an unprecedented level of politics into the CIA's objectives and going so far as to deny the findings of the U.S. intelligence community as a whole in an attempt to protect the president from any type of Russian connection. For example, to show the kind of guy that Mike Pompeo is, shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing, Pompeo suggested Islamic faith leaders were actually encouraging terrorist activities, and he called an Indian American Democratic opponent when he was running for Congress a turban topper. So he's obviously just the cream of the crop, and it makes perfect sense why he would get a more powerful position in the Trump administration. Only the best for the Trump administration. His replacement at the CIA, Deputy Director Gina Haspel, I think I'm saying that right, who is a veteran of the CIA, but was reportedly involved in a black site in Thailand where enhanced interrogation, aka torture, occurred. Her nomination has already been met with bipartisan resistance, but in a weird turn of events, she also has bipartisan support. So I have absolutely no idea what to make of that. If it's not one thing, it's another in this Trump administration, and for some reason, we've decided to, or our president has decided to elevate the CIA director, a man that didn't have any experience in the intelligence community and doesn't have any qualifications to run the State Department, to one of the most powerful positions in Washington and really therefore the world. So, this can only go well. On that cheery note, we move towards our next topic, the story that seems to get worse for the Trump administration by the week, everybody's favorite, Russia. This week, in the ever-expanding Russia-Trump storyline, the Attorney General fired the former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, 26 hours before he could retire and receive the pension he had worked towards for 21 years, which really is one of the top 5 most petty moments probably of all time. The basis of the firing is that McCabe allowed 2 officials to speak to reporters about his opening of an investigation into the Clinton Foundation as part of a larger investigation into how the FBI handled itself during the course of the 2016 election season. Always a symbol of class, the president took to Twitter Saturday morning to gloat and to praise the firing of McCabe and, of course, take some shots at Hillary. All of which occurred after suggesting way back in July of 2017 that McCabe be fired in the first place. McCabe responded to his firing by calling out the president for being vindictive, surprise, surprise, and painting the situation as a broader play to discredit not only the FBI, but the intelligence community as a whole that continues various Russian investigations. The president taking such an involved approach to personnel decisions is almost unprecedented, especially in something like the FBI, where there's supposed to be some distance between the office of the president and the FBI's operations. It also doesn't exactly help his case that he didn't obstruct justice in some way, something that is proving very hard for him to stay away from incriminating himself over. The other big development this week in the Russia investigation, the data firm that the Trump administration, the then Trump presidential campaign decided to use for their campaign, in charge of what has been described as shockingly effective data operations, might have some dealings with Russia. The firm, Cambridge Analytica, obtained data of about 50 million users without their permission through Facebook, that allowed them to build profiles of people to determine when and where ads for the president's campaign would be most effective. Now, Cambridge Analytica has done business with Russian entities in the past that have connections to the Kremlin and Putin himself, including on the topic of how data was used to target American voters. Of course, we can't make it through a Russia-Trump topic without mentioning everybody's favorite, the favorite Trump son, Jared Kushner, who was the one who advocated to bring Cambridge Analytica into the fray of the Trump campaign. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller has taken an interest in the role of Cambridge Analytica and their Russian connections, and yet another round of bad news for the Trump administration and the favorite Trump son, Jared Kushner, in particular. So that pretty much wraps up this week's episode of Politically Charged. Like I said, there's going to be a special edition, special episode, special, I don't know what in the world to call it, but it's going to be dropping Wednesday or Thursday morning. Haven't quite figured that out yet. It's going to be pretty good. But, I am just a tad bit biased. And before I end the episode, I feel like it's, well, maybe not necessary, but I feel like I want to, and it's my podcast, so I'm going to reiterate how important it is for the Democratic Party to remain the big tent party, to remain inclusive. Debate and discussion like the kinds that are going on right now in the Democratic Party are great for the Democratic Party, are great for any kind of organization. There should be that open discussion of ideas and ideals, and they need to be debated on and brought to the public's attention. But we can't allow the media to frame it as a democratic civil war, which it's been allowed to be framed as up to this point. It's important to remember, too, that had Trump not won this incredibly improbable victory, Republicans would be in an all-out civil war right now, basically doing the same thing between the Tea Party wing, the ultra-right wing, which has taken an increased hold on the Republican Party, and the moderates, people that actually want to get things done. So I'm not saying that Democrats need to compromise with Republicans on every issue or give up on democratic ideals, but I do think that we need to focus on finding common ground and avoid coming up with some kind of rigid standard that everybody needs to meet just to be considered a Democrat. So with that being said, that wraps up this episode, I believe about a minute and a half after I said it the first time. I am, of course, Jack Berlin. This is Politically Charged. You can find us at politicallycharged.us. I'm on Twitter, at Jack Berlin. Very special episode, dropping Wednesday or Thursday. Not quite sure when yet. We out.